There won't be no highlights on the 11 o'clock news and no pictures of Harry armed women liberationists and Jackie Onassis blowing her nose. The theme song will not be written by Jim Webb or Francis Scott Keys, nor sung by Glenn Campbell, Tom Jones, Johnny Cash, Engelbert Humperdinck, or The Rare Earth. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white lightning, or white people. You will not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom, the tiger in your tank, or the giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with Coke. The revolution will not fight germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
Well, good morning or good afternoon. I don't know where you're coming from, but I thank you all for joining us today for day 2 of Archiving the Black Web. I am Makiba Foster, and I lead the African American Research Library and Cultural Center in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which is a part of the Broward County Library System. And I also serve as the project director for Archiving the Black Web. And so I mean, it's not often that I get to come onto the virtual stage after being, with Gil Scott-Heron telling us about the revolution. So I'm very grateful to have been able to be a part of creating this space for you, so we can talk about the things that are important to our community as it relates to Black presence in online spaces. So this afternoon, this morning, I would like to welcome the first time attendees joining us today, and to our repeat participants who joined us yesterday. Thank you for coming back, and thank you for making yesterday absolutely amazing. My heart is full. And, I hope you all keep the chat lit like you did yesterday, because I have never been a part of a webinar where, the chat was on fire, the panelists were just spitting truth. So I'm just thankful that we're going to repeat this again today. And also just to let you know that you all helped us break really some record numbers in terms of attendance, where yesterday we had almost 1,000 people in and out of the session. So thank you for spreading the word. I hope you told some other folks to join us today, because today is going to be just as great. And so it's because of the support of our funders, the Institute of Library and Museum Services, that we are able to bring this project to you of Archiving the Black Web, and also our partners in this endeavor, particularly the African American Museum and Library at Oakland, Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American Culture and History, as well as Langston Hughes Community Library and Cultural Center, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, Spelman College Archives, and of course, our partners with Shift Collective. And so today is another full day of robust conversations, of listening to Black people discuss their own practices and behaviors in the online space. And so these conversations present rich opportunities for practicing memory workers to think deeply and reimagine how we build archival collections for future users. And so since you all enjoyed the music so much yesterday from our showcase speaker, Lamar Harris, AKA DJ Noonie, and some of the intermission kind of music sessions we've had, he has agreed to host a live DJ set at 2:55 Eastern Time Zone. So I hope you will join us after we re-air the showcase, because that's how we do. So if you're wondering about what the title is, just tune in. We're giving a platform for some of our people to be able to show out, and so some of the work that they're doing. And also today, which is really, I'm very proud of my project advisor, Burgess Jules. He has been the mastermind behind some of the panelists that you've been seeing. Just a really great brother, and I'm glad to be in this work with him. He has coordinated that today. You will see in the screen somewhere we have ASL interpreters for today's panel. So we're trying to walk the walk and do the work as well in terms of creating inclusive spaces. So thank you to our ASL interpreters for being with us today. And so now for the first session for day 2, we have an awesome panel titled Fight for Power, Activism and Action Online and Documenting Local Community Organizing Efforts. And so our speakers include scholars and organizers and memory workers who will address several important topics related to activism on and offline, including the use of social media as a tool in the arsenal of community organizing. They will also discuss cultural memory organizations documenting local organizational efforts in the digital space and in real life. And today's session is being moderated by the lovely Dr. Tara Conley, who is the assistant professor of the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. So Dr. Conley will introduce her esteemed panelists today. And so with that, I will turn it over to this panel because it is full of people in the streets, online, and in real life doing the work. So thank you all for joining us today, and keep the chat lit and make sure that you share your questions with us so we can have another engaging day. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahiba, and thank you, Burgess, and everyone else for putting together this amazing panel and conference. I am super, super excited and just above beyond excited to be here. So welcome to this panel. If it's the morning on the East Coast or afternoon, wherever you're chiming in from. Yes, so this panel, Fight for Power, Activism and Action Online and Documenting Local Community Organizing Efforts. As Makiba mentioned, I'm Tara L. Conley, the moderator for today's session, assistant professor at Communication and Media at Montclair State, and the Race and Technology Practitioner Fellow at Stanford University. As I mentioned, I'm super grateful to be part of this panel as an engaged listener, primarily because my work on documenting online organizing and storytelling practices aligns very much with the scholarship and the organizing work carried out by our panelists every day. So I know we're going to learn a great deal from each other. So let me first introduce quickly the panelists, and then we'll get going. So first we have Dr. Sarah J. Jackson, Presidential Associate Professor and Co-Director of Media, Inequality, and Change at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Next we have, next we have Teresa Rayford, Founder and Executive Director of Don't Shoot Portland, as well as Ty Carpenter, Board President of Don't Shoot Portland. Next, we have Asha Ransby-Sporn, co-director of organizing at Dissenters. And finally, we have Yusef Omowale, director of the Southern California Library. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All right, let's get to it. I want to start with an opening question for all of our panelists. So we're coming into this virtual space after yet another incredibly difficult week confronting the consequences of state violence in our communities. So given that this session is about documenting online organizing efforts, I'd like to know from our panelists, in your work as organizers, practitioners, memory workers, academics, how have you been tracking and mapping and documenting and organizing around this moment? So in other words, how are you using the web in your own work to document this moment wherein the value of Black lives continues to be contested across public spaces? Teresa, I want to start with you, given your work with Don't Shoot Portland.
Well, actually, since the Ferguson uprisings, we've used social media to communicate to various communities that are doing the uprising work because of the resource need. And Ferguson in 2014, it was getting batteries and lighters and food and water out to the community because of how the state responded to the protest and how schools were shut down and how we knew that that vulnerable community that was doing that work needed resources in order to continue that consistent movement that we all benefit from today, because of the allocation and redistribution of resources and the highlighting of, politicians and the acquiescence of leaders. And just sharing that information, building the hashtags, sharing the GoFundMes, building mutual aid in places where protests are happening so that the people showing up don't have to worry about the response and retaliation of the state, and so that they can be secured in community building during these uprisings, and which communicates even more solidarity All of that is done online. A lot of that has been, as we've seen in some of the different circumstances, a lot of that has been the only way that we would even know that these circumstances are happening. I remember when Corinne Gaines was using Facebook to kind of document what was happening in Baltimore when she was being stopped by the police, and then the eventual murder that occurred, and how Facebook went in and intercepted and worked with the police to shut off her phone lines. It showed the importance of that social community being able to activate a response and document what's happening so that we can utilize it for justice later. If she hadn't, posted all those different Instagrams and all these different Facebook stories, we wouldn't have been able to create a circumstance to show the entire movement of the police in regards to how they were stalking her and, kind of just connecting with her. And again, like with, Philando Castile and, with Mike Brown, all of these different people documenting the 4.5 hours that community had to sit out there. And then everybody in all these other communities being able to say, hey, in our community, they allow people to die and expire on the street rather than, supporting them with medical care. There is no preservation of life in my neighborhood, and I'm not even in Ferguson, Missouri. So what's going on legally within policy that's allowing them to not respond to provide medical support? Like just documenting and building direct resources. We call it direct engagement. And a lot of times, like with the Trump administration, his biggest question was, where are all these activists and organizers getting all of this money? Where are these resources coming from? And it was like, well, we've been paying for funerals for so long. When COVID hit, even before the murder of George Floyd, we were activating mutual aid networks so that we could provide resources to our communities, and not just the activists on the ground and the families affected, but the entirety of our communities. And so, we use that's our communication tool. It doesn't cost a lot of money. You keep your phone on and you can activate. Again, in 2015, we were teaching people how to document police activities, not the protesters, so that they could actually document which people were harming them. And that gave agencies like ours an opportunity, again, to bring those police to accountability, or at least to hold the cities and the states responsible because of the assaults witnessed by so many people, intentionally documenting them and understanding know your rights and everything else, and using the phone and social media to kind of make sure that everyone's on the same page in such an uprising time. I hope that answers.
Yeah, yes.
I got grandkids here, y'all.
All right, that's all right. Ty, I want to go to you as well to kind of expand on that conversation around what you all have been doing on the ground.
Absolutely. And when it comes to the web, like Teresa said, I don't think it can be understated enough how we really do use the internet as a tool to communicate and to share what's going on, because we already know that we can't rely on the media or other agencies to tell our narrative, because there's always going to create this divisiveness, which can then be used against the movement. So it's important that we actually use social media to tell our stories, to keep track of our online footprint too. You can see the fact that things really haven't changed, that we're still fighting the same situations. We're still coming into these same detrimental environments. We're still experiencing police violence. I think we're able to back it up more because people are able to share their testimonies online. Even when this all first started, when COVID first broke out, we started using social media in order to deliver aid to folks in Portland and the greater city areas that were without resources, elders that weren't able to go to the grocery stores by themselves, just providing it in that way. And then when the protests began, we instantly created a living document full of resources, vetted links, organizations on the ground in Minneapolis when it first erupted there. That's when we were trying to find grassroots groups there, connect with them. Fortunately, the web allowed us to connect with those organizers and see what they needed. So people that were looking to support, they had a list of vetted resources and documents, bail funds, legal firms that were willing to support protesters, sharing information, people that were getting lost, people that were getting harmed at protests, being able to, share their stories and stay on the lookout for different tactics as well being used by police against protesters, being able to identify You know, when the feds were here and they were throwing people into unmarked vans, that was very scary. We were able to find out, people were, you know, emailing us saying, hey, I work near the airport. Hey, I work at this hotel. They're giving rooms to the feds. You know, they're right over here. They're doing this. I witnessed this, you know, showing us video. Without that, I really think that that story, the truth wouldn't be out there as much. You know, we would be relying on other people to tell our story.
Right, right. Asha, given your work too in organizing, do you echo these sort of sentiments that have been already described, or is there anything else that you would add to that?
Yeah, definitely. I'll kind of speak a little bit from the multiple networks and formations I'm rooted in. So my organization, Dissenters, which is a youth anti-militarist organization. I'm also deeply involved in our local defund CPD fight here in Chicago, and have organized with BYP 100 for a long time as well. So young people in all of these formations who are fighting militarism, who are fighting against policing, who believe in abolition of systems of prisons and policing. Essentially, we're fighting to become a new common sense when it comes to what we understand as safety, one where we actually allow ourselves to see the type of society that will truly keep us safe and provide us with all the things that you know, communities need to be well and that young people need for a livable future. And so winning a narrative and winning people over to that story and allowing folks to actually see what that looks like is essential and key to the strategy of actually combating these systems of intensely violent policing and militarism that we're up against. And I think that we can't do that work without, you know, the social media, without, you know, all kinds of online tools that are at our disposal in this time. I think documentation is key. You know, online tools are both a part of how we document the work, and it's a part of where and how we do the work. It's how we find each other, you know. I remember vividly the night of watching the Minneapolis Police Department burn to the ground in a Twitter video. Just like, you know, that's also where I saw the Quick Trip in 2014, the gas station, you know, be burned to the ground in Ferguson in 2014. And I know how many other people in my own community were watching those things because of how things then erupted in, you know, at home in Chicago and all across the country. And I think that there's something just really powerful in the kind of rapid and, you know, and I mean, you know, Twitter is a corporation, of course, but, you know, it still has some level of democratic access that we can utilize it to share and spread information and connect with one another. Yeah, so that's a little bit of what I'll say. I think it's a powerful tool for connecting, to sharing stories, to painting kind of visual and, you know, direct voices of what a world without police might actually look like and what, you know, how that shows up in our resistance struggles.
Right. Thank you. And so, Dr. Jackson, I want to come to you because what I'm hearing from our organizers is we're talking about counter narratives, we're talking about counter publics, we're talking about storytelling movements through organizers' perspectives. And this is kind of like your wheelhouse. So I'm wondering from you, from the academic side and the researcher side, the scholarship side, how are you using these tools and what have you kind of seen come about?
Yeah, well, it's such an honor to be here and hear from the folks on the ground doing the work. And I just really appreciate their time because I know their time is so precious. I mean, you know, as Ty said, you know, activists face this situation where they can't rely on the mainstream media to create narratives. And that's absolutely true because of the reliance on elite sources, which are often in the case, for example, of police brutality, right, narratives and framing. And so much of this is a battle, a storytelling battle, a story over narrative. Whereas, as Asha said, winning the narrative is so often what is at stake for activists and organizers. And so this challenge has been a long-standing challenge for you know, activists and social movements who are trying to promulgate messages to the public, who are trying to raise public consciousness, but often have to rely on sort of mainstream media institutions and mainstream journalists to translate, and often they do a bad job, right, translating activist sort of goals and demands. And so direct communication from activists and from social movements is incredibly important. And, one of the things that social media has given us, and, I'm sure there have been other panels where we can talk about the bad things social media has given us. But one of the things, we've got from social media is, as these folks said, the direct communication, the direct stories, the direct narrative, right? The direct intervention has increased in terms of its reach because of social media. You can log on and really see people on the ground doing this work. You can find the mutual aid organizations. And so in our #activism book, my co-authors and I, we tracked how Black folks and others, spread stories and really intervened in the dominant frames, the white supremacist frames, to shift conversations on police brutality, forms of violence that Black women face, uniquely, and other things. And really, we thought about how digital spaces then get used not only for these types of narrative promulgation that these folks are talking about, but also for creating the kind of identities and solidarities in some cases that can reach a greater number of people because of the direct communication and because of the ways that folks can sort of reach out and find one another across communities. So obviously, as these folks said, what happens online matters because it can be a site for intervention into the dominant and white supremacist narratives of all these social issues that we're fighting against. And because increasingly, I think, an important point here is that what happens on social media has a real impact on the public and policy. What happens on social media, what trends on social media now gets picked up by mainstream news organizations, and they sort of get forced then to talk about what, the activist claims are. And we saw that in some of the cases that we've studied, but also then in turn, policymakers and politicians, right, get forced to address some of these issues. So when we have, live video from activists on the ground that shows that what the police said happened didn't happen, right, and that goes viral, it very much shifts the conversation around actions and other issues. And so that's, sort of some of the ways that we've taken up social media in our work and thinking through like really that narrative change, not just online, not just on the ground, but through, mainstream and policy making as well.
Right. And so you're also making me think now too about kind of trying to bring it back full circle about this documenting and the importance of sort of this archival work. So Yusuf, I want to come to you because this is also part of what you do in terms of thinking about the tools, social media's tools for advancing justice in these archival space. Can you talk a little bit about how you've been using these tools in your own work?
Well, I think in terms of, for us, this moment is more an indicator of our failure as an organization, as an archive in particular. And I think archival work in general, as we kind of are existing ahistorically in public spaces where the carceral logics of punishment are the dominant discourse. And so we just had an anniversary of the LA uprisings in 1992. And certainly the not guilty verdicts of the police officers was the spark, but the movement was not about trying to get police officers locked up. It was not about prison and carcerality as a solution. And so I think that's part of the struggle that we're dealing with. And so also kind of the notions of relative innocence of activists that want to claim peaceful protest. And so for us, historically, dissent is never peaceful, but it also is an agreement with the kind of defining characteristic of the state, which is that they have a monopoly over legitimate use of violence, right? So that if I kill somebody in a state uniform, that's policy. But if I'm upset with my inability to live and I burn a police station down, right, that's violence and criminality. And where that also leads to is that in terms of social media, we saw people from our neighborhood in South Central use social media strategically to connect to places where they thought activists would be upset to loot. And then we delegitimize other aspects of our community as looters and violent actors, even though they're using media in intentional ways because we want to claim innocence. And so I think for us, in a variety of ways, we're trying to figure out how to bring back a historical context to understand the conditions that we're living in, what dissent has been historically, and what our goals should be beyond carceral logics.
Ooh, yes, right. And so let's talk about it, because this is one of the questions that I've had that I wanted to especially talk with you about, sort of the ethical considerations of documenting sort of social movements and these public spaces. I want to specifically focus on, and Asha, I want to come to you because you do sort of public facing work as well. Can you talk about some of the ethical considerations to note when archiving or even representing sort of traces of protests and community organizing online? What should we be cautious about? What should we be considerate of? It's kind of, especially doing this kind of public facing community organizing work.
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the biggest kind of considerations has to do with risk, particularly, I mean, in general, but particularly in the context of protest. Activists take, and, folks in community take risks all the time in service of protesting really violent systems. And in order to affect, real change, we're 100% building on a legacy of, ancestors' previous struggles that have taken big risks for what they believe to be right. I don't think that there's any historical examples of, transformative change that has happened without that, right? And within that, I think folks that are documenting struggles, particularly in protests, need to be mindful of, is that documentation happening in a way that, helps amplify the struggle, but is also mindful of, not exacerbating risks that folks might be choosing to take. So just to be a little more specific with that, here in Chicago, in our local, struggle to defund police, we've had massive protests for many years, but particularly in this last year, where, folks have been intensely beat by the police, folks have been arrested, and folks have been charged with things in many cases, unfairly. And Yusuf spoke a little bit about, the police having a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. They also have, some power over shaping the narrative, both when it comes to what gets, brought into a courtroom to kind of talk about, as follow-up to charges folks may get in a protest, and in the media. So I think with that, folks that are photographers, photojournalists, even other protesters, whoever you are documenting in a protest, I think it's important just to be mindful that you're not spreading something that could be used against someone. We have seen huge numbers of people that are facing cases and now, having to fight that from the protests in the last year. And that is certainly not a new thing. Police work hard to frame protesters, from the Ferguson uprisings to the protests last summer. We've seen activists targeted by police and by prosecutors and by local officials for engaging in protest. This whole movement around defunding police, talking about police budgets, there's a big chunk in those police budgets that goes towards media, communications, and towards press. I have had, people that I care about falsely charged with felonies over a photo from a protest that just looked bad. They didn't touch a police officer, but it can easily be kind of, misconstrued to say that, oh, that's someone, the charge of assaulting a police officer or resisting arrest. Those are go-to charges that police will give people, oftentimes ungrounded. So anyway, I'm saying this to say, I think that's a big thing. People are taking real risks that have real consequences. And when we're documenting struggles, I think it's just important to make sure that we're mindful of the level of risk that folks engaged in protest and resistance work are actually taking on. And just like the level of power that the police have to actually manipulate that. I think police are like one of the main sources that mainstream media, if they get a piece of information from the police, they don't always double check that. They don't always have a second source for that piece of information. And so, if there's a photo placing someone in a protest or something that, can be used against someone. So I think that's important. There are things that folks have all kinds of, information online about how to blur faces or other identifying info in protests, how to take pictures of what's going on without zooming in on someone's face and things like that. So yeah, I think that's a part of it. I saw someone put in the chat the piece around, I think consent and also connectedness to community and to movement are key, right? If you're keyed into, a particular struggle and community, you're going to be kind of in touch with some of these dynamics or expectations that, folks engaging in protests may have. And yeah, the only other piece I'll say, right, is that I think, documentation is not neutral. It always has a lens, right? And so I think just like the portrayal, not seeing folks that are doing the work of documentation as outside of, but, a dynamic part of, the community and struggle that's going on. And I think that, it shouldn't be happening in a way that's extractive or transactional, or treats organizers and movements as kind of like, that doesn't treat them as genuine expert voices on what's going on. Organizers and folks in community engaged in resistance work have, I believe, expert framing on the issues that they organize around. And I think those voices should be uplifted and not kind of flattened or erased in service of the, perspective of whoever the documenter is. So yeah, connectedness, consent, risk. Those I think are some of the most important considerations.
Sure, thank you. Teresa, you had your virtual hand raised.
Yeah, I was going to say that like in a lot of our programming and community engagement, we're literally educating and developing what that looks like for our community, what documenting the protest looks like, what filming the police looks like, what, sharing those images, writing your own opinion editorials so that we have the narrative of people that were right there on the ground to specifically already be available to us. We would create event pages and we would ask everyone to share their photos and, information that they witnessed in that event page so that we could catalog and document those day of events for in case something else happened. We spent a considerable amount of time after the Ferguson protests, not only doing Know Your Rights training, but also helping with the ACLU's development of the police, the Film the Police, the ACLU app that helps you document police interactions for that same reason, because we saw people coming to the protests and taking pictures of our signs and taking pictures of faces and clothing. And we were like, hey, can you please capture the badges and the documentation on these officers? Can you look at what kind of equipment they're showing up with? Can you look at what they're not showing up with? Can we look at, we would find these Blue Shield badges. We noticed that after Darren Wilson was murdered, after he murdered Mike Brown, that they were wearing all these different things because we were intentionally trying to find out who they were in relativity. And once we started kind of reporting who the harmful police were and what their backgrounds were and what their social media was saying about the protests, like we're going to run people over, or we have to babysit these, these Black people, or we're going to, we need people to show up to help us. We were able to kind of grab that information and not just assume that we had white nationalists coming up and working in partnership with the police. We were able to kind of identify and document it because our intention was to capture them in the process of harming us. And though we knew that their position as state agents to harm us wasn't illegal, we felt that if we continued moving and we continued documenting it, that as we make these complaints, that it would become illegal because it would be documented. It was important to document every form of harm. We had been kettled one night, and the next day we had probably over 200 people show up at the city to file complaints with the Independent Police Review. Not because we felt that they would see that there was harm in the police, but we knew that it would push forward an audit of their techniques and their strategy to use those kind of endeavors to stop us from protesting. So again, it's a lot of the community education connecting with the protesters will give us, the tools that we need to kind of dismantle the state violence as it's happening. I don't think that it'll stop happening, but I think that, again, if you don't say that there's a problem, and you don't have evidence of the problem, then you can never change it. And right now, like with our lawsuits against the use of tear gas and the use of munitions last year during the George Floyd protest, not only against the city, but also following those lawsuits against the state, it gave us, again, an opportunity to, send out a link to protesters and ask them to send us documentation of the harm and of the people that were hurting them, so that we can use it in future times, because we know that we're not going to stop the state right now from harming, people, but we know that we'll have that information and evidence for future generations.
Great, thank you. And I want to stick with this issue of framing, because it sounds like, we have this issue of, scholarship framing, protest movements. We have the grassroots, even the archival spaces, community spaces, sort of doing this kind of public framing work. And then Asha, to your point about how law enforcement themselves are doing this kind of framing work in public spaces, I want to talk about that. And I really want to get a sense from everyone, given their different areas of coming into this conversation. So the implications of law enforcement framing protests, folks might call it police propaganda and so on. And I'll open this up to anyone who wants to jump in on this. So what are the implications of the way that we frame social protests, coming from your own personal expertise, but also in thinking about the way that law enforcement does that work? So anyone can jump in on this one. Yeah, Dr. Jackson, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in on that. I've written a bit about this, and one of the things, I call it cop speak or propaganda, but one of the things that we know, as I mentioned earlier, is that mainstream media organizations have traditionally considered police and police organizations and the state in general as a legitimate source, and a more legitimate source than ordinary folks on the street sources. And this is why, in many of these cases from, I think most recently, the murder of George Floyd is a great example. If you go back and you look at the press release that came out from the police that called it a medical incident, right, and didn't mention, right, what actually happened, is that we know that early on, that's how it was then picked up and reported by journalists, and that it required sort of the narrative interventions and the frame interventions from community members and activists who witnessed it, who in this case had a video, to prove to the public and to the media that that's not what happened. And so unfortunately, there's a double standard there often, where the police are believed first unless there's evidence to disprove them, which of course puts this burden on activists. But I think that this very much has seeped into even our language and the things we can and can't imagine about abolition, because so often the use of passive voice in the coverage of police violence, and the use of frames in particular, there's something called the protest paradigm, where researchers in political communication have found that overwhelmingly media negatively frame activists. And it's not just Black activists, it's not just on issues related to police and policing, but activists in general tend to be treated as sort of a social threat. They're framed within frames of conflict, right? Which shifts the way that we understand or are able to think about and imagine change. And of course, this is sort of then doubly forced onto Black activists, who then also face stereotypes of Black incivility, which are, all over, our media, and dog whistles and all kinds of things, right, from the elite sources. And so this is very much an issue of, and again, I think to our earlier point, part of why it's so important for activists to be able to tell their stories directly and themselves, and part of why it's important for us to have evidence and an archive that very much bolsters the work of activists. If I can, I wanted to just say one thing about what Asha was saying earlier about the privacy and surveillance issue that is connected. We had an incident this past summer in Philadelphia where there were newspaper journalists on site taking photos of a protest. A photo was taken of a protester who appeared to be engaging in something that the criminal legal system thought was illegal. And we all had masks on, but they were able to zoom into a tattoo on her arm and zoom into the t-shirt she was wearing. And they found the Etsy shop that sold the t-shirt and contacted the Etsy seller and asked the Etsy seller for the data on who had bought this shirt based on who lived in what city. And they were able to track this protester down, and she was charged with a very, very, very serious felony. And that's a great example of why, we have to take a lot of care about the documentation. The documentation is important, but the folks who are out there from mainstream media organizations who are documenting aren't thinking about the way their documentation can cause harm. And so I think that's why it's especially important for scholars, archivists, and others to really be in community with activists to understand that there are ways to document that don't feed in to the framing that comes out of sort of the police propaganda machine.
Absolutely. If anyone else can jump in, but I also want to add too, because now I'm thinking about this relationship between anonymity and advocacy. And I guess, especially for our organizers, how do you strike that balance? And what have you seen in terms on the field? What are some of the practices that you've seen come out of this contentious kind of space of anonymity versus activism? Yes, Yusuf, go ahead.
Just in terms of the framing conversation, and I think racial capitalism is a hell of an author because of being able to define what these narratives, again, the dominant kind of hegemonic narratives become about what we want, and they finding the horizon of justice as police officers getting locked up. So like this past summer when you had NBA players, right, protesting, and part of the demands was like, we want the officers locked up and then, until we play, right? And it was interesting because there was an NBA game where a playoff game where the Boston Celtics had like Black Lives Matter slogans on the back of their jersey. And they had little emblems and advertisement for General Electric on the front of their jerseys, right? And so the kind of amnesia and not knowing. And so, I'm not criticizing the players because I think they was willing to sacrifice a lot of what they were about to benefit our communities. But the imagination was, we want to lock cops up. At the same time, we're supporting General Electric, and we have no idea that they're one of the largest manufacturers of weapons and death in the world, right? And so, and then what if the NBA players had said, well, you know what, we're not playing until there's universal healthcare. They're not going to, NBA ain't putting slogans on the back for healthcare, right? So this is the ways in which some of these narratives get defined. So even in this moment where 500,000 people dead of COVID, much less people dying of malnutrition, young people dying in restraints and treatment centers, there's all kinds of ways just dying that we're doing. And the state is trying to figure out, well, everything has changed, the economy's under duress. And so now at this moment, what are we talking about? Asian hate, right? So now there's legislation for hate crimes. And then January 6th, and again, a lot of us were like, oh, these are insurrectionists going to the Capitol. They're doing a coup. Well, what does it mean for people in the United States to call that what happened on January 6th a coup, given the history of United States intervention around the world and what coups actually look like for people, right? That's a state-defined narrative that benefits the state, because instead of talking about redistribution of resources, we're talking about locking officers up, and the state had got no problem locking officers up, firing some officers. They just don't want you talking about money, resources, healthcare, education, all of these things. And so I think that's the way in which not just how they frame us in their media, but also how they get us to frame ourselves and get us to frame what we're fighting for.
Interpolation. Snaps. I see some snaps in the chat for that one. Yes. Would anyone else like to add to that? I think this is I don't mind sticking with the framing conversation, because I think this, in everything that we do, we're dealing with that framing question. But Ty, I want to open it up to you as well with this question.
Yeah, just talking about propaganda and how they really do, it seems like they're like a legitimate source for information. It really brought to mind our initial lawsuit against the city of Portland in June against tear gas. We filed a restraining order against PPB in order to ban the use of tear gas, because as they were kettling, which is one of their main policing methods during a protest, they were, just unloading vast amounts of tear gas onto folks who were trying to disperse and run away. They were trapping them in the gas, using those toxins during a respiratory pandemic in order to trap, create coughing, create, discourse among the protesters just trying to get to safety. So I think something very important that we were able to do, because it was able to sort of dismiss that narrative. It showed what was happening on the ground, which was the kettling, which was the conflicting commands being brought by police officers to protesters to disperse, and then grabbing them and trapping them and targeting them. We had a team called Sit2 NYC, and they do digital reconstruction. And by using protester videos that were sent in to us by people on the ground, they were able to use that same footage and pair it with drone and aerial footage of the streets to show you a digital map of where the police union building was, seeing protesters walk by, begin dispersing, and then you see the police charging them, ripping their banners away, beating them with sticks. It was just extremely violent. And I think the more that video, when it was played in court during litigation, it was very powerful. I think that's a big reason why we had that win, is because it was one of the first times it actually illuminated the fact that, yes, the police are reckless. The police do thrive on aggression and inflicting violence, especially to folks that are showing up for Black lives. So I think that was just a really big piece of our litigation and being able to secure that restraining order. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without the use of the web and without asking protesters, hey, we have some intake forms online. Are you willing to share your experience? Giving them the opportunity to speak to our legal team. We had over 300 plaintiffs, and I'm just so proud of those people who had to deal with the pain over 300 days of straight protest, and they were able to recount those experiences in court for history, for all of us. And that's what created that circumstance for us to fight for that.
What I'm also hearing in this conversation is sort of thinking about social media and technology in general, that technology's role in influencing or having something to say about our collective memory of this moment. Teresa, I'm going to go to you, but Yusuf, I'm going to come back to you on this question about, social media as tools and influence on our collective memory of social protests. But Teresa, I want to make sure that you use this opportunity.
Oh, I just wanted to say, when we talk about the framing, again, we filed that lawsuit against the city and we talked about the tear gas, but then the city and city partners in the status quo actually used some of the same evidence that we provided to kind of create a conflict with Donald Trump, when in fact they were doing the same thing on the record. They were doing it just as violently. And I mean, at that point, because Donald Trump started, sending in federal troops, city leaders that had never showed up for Black lives, organizations, agencies that had really deflected back to violence against building rather than violence happening against people. They used the narrative that we developed to kind of build this fight against Donald Trump for, political reasons. It helped, get him out of office, but it didn't provide accountability for what we were seeking in regards to solidarity or engagement, political activism from their resource, pits. So it could work both ways. I mean, they're literally identifying and watching everything that organizers and activists do so that they can counter it, and also so that they can use it fluidly to push their own agendas later. And in doing that, again, when they brought in defund the police, we've been saying that forever. We've been saying, we wanted to defund our gang task force and all these community partnerships, community policing, because we know that it inherently identifies and creates a referral and propaganda opportunity for agencies to benefit from these referrals of overrepresenting our children and getting them displaced, and overrepresenting adults and creating mass incarceration. But they use that community engagement tool that we provide as community in mutual aid against us. And that's, again, another reason why Dr. Jackson is so important for the activists and the archivist community to connect, because we don't have those resources. We don't have the resource of media. We don't have the resource of big foundations saying, now we care about Black lives, and creating their own t-shirts and their own propaganda. We were not connected to any of the organizing where, basketball players started showing up wearing their stuff, and we weren't the recipients of any of their generosity through those corporate partnerships. And a lot of them we wouldn't want anyway, but we don't want them to participate in this movement that is literally built off of dead people who we've lost. You're literally propagating, from the murder of people that have died. And it's just hard. It's hard for us to keep, pushing the position that we're pushing when it looks as if our status quo agencies are doing the same thing, but we're just not participating in a way that's not rude or whatever. But yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for that. So Yusuf, then I want to come to you because you do this sort of archival work. What have you seen as sort of some archival practices that are helping us with our collective memory of these moments and doing it in a way that honors the organizing work while at the same time making sure that the counter narratives are central focus. So can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done or some of the practices that maybe you've observed that help us push toward that goal?
Well, just on the comment of resources, right? Yeah, like we don't have the resources, but there's millions and millions of dollars going out in the last few years, particularly universities and dominant archives to do community archival work. So the money's there, it's just not going to us, right? And so work like Don't Shoot Portland, Doc Now, all these other groups are doing great work, but we all struggle to do that with a lack of resources. In terms of just two things to mention, I think that what's happening in this moment is social media has also kind of made us all neoliberal and Western in the sense of just like, oh, Columbus discovered America, even though there's people already here. And so on social media, there's this tradition of like, I started this movement. When I don't know how you can start an organization. I don't know how you claim to start a movement that's about a lot of people. And then that gets certain traction, right? And so then there'll be people who are activists who will get a fellowship at university. And on their bio, it says, I coined the term unapologetically Black. And so I'm kind of like, there becomes this culture of I needed to claim this. And so certainly with things like, oh, hey, this person is appropriating TikTok dances and they're not showing the Black young people that started these dances. I think that's obviously a problem. But the way that we're solving it now is like, well, they should also be on the Tonight Show. And for me, it's like, well, if Elvis is stealing the blues, that's a problem. But our collective goal is not to make sure that John Lee Hooker gets paid. Well, certainly we would love that. But we're trying to change the conditions that created the blues in the first place. And so that's more of what we're looking at. I think the other big issue that we're seeing is that there's articles coming out about these protests, about these movements, like in The Guardian and a variety of things. I saw one particularly in The Guardian that was talking about Los Angeles. And because of the activists that they spoke to, who have a vested interest in promoting themselves and erasing a lot of the history of what happened, that 20 years from now, much less if you're on the East Coast and don't know LA, you're going to think that article is accurate. And there's subtle things in there that lead you to think what their resistance was about, and it really wasn't. And it's not that there's necessarily a truth, a universal truth, but there's already erasure happening in the way that community members are talking about issues that then become part of an archive that people are not going to know the gaps later on. And so we always encourage people, like we say, we don't have the real archives, the revolutionary archives, we have archives, and you should engage them critically. And for us, and that's why we talked about the looters, is that people that did looting, is that we're not trying to just tell stories of the heroes or the thugs or whatever. We're trying to restore complexity to our humanity. That what happens with racism is we're denied the complexity of our humanity. We are many things. We have many strategies, and we love all of our people. And so that's what we're trying to document and find ways to do that. And we've seen, as people are talking about, the police create whole archives they use in court to try to get people to go to prison. And they'll show pictures of them with we've had people give us photographs of them and their friends to keep in our safe, so the police don't see who their friends are because they will get criminalized, right? And that's the other point that I'll end on, is that I agree everything that people said about there's ways in which we need to protect our communities from being further criminalized, while the pictures we take and all that. At the same time, for us, we understand that Black life in general is already vulnerable and is already at risk. So whenever we gather, if we protest, if we sing, if we go to the barbecue, we're being criminalized and we're under threat. And so we always want to be mindful of what kind of strategy we use to care for ourselves. At the same time, understanding it's not the documenting that's putting us at risk. It's the state, it's capital racism, it's white supremacy. That's what's putting us at risk.
Absolutely. Would anyone like to follow up on that? Because I kind of want to stick with this sort of conversation that we're having around sort of framing, but also thinking about our practices in the context of trying to do this work in the context of state violence. So does anyone else like to jump in on that?
Yeah, I do really appreciate that last comment that Yusuf made. And yeah, the thing I just want to kind of offer to the conversation around framing is I think that, you know, there's a kind of reactionary way sometimes that we respond to harmful narratives about Black and Brown folks, particularly when it comes to policing, that then inadvertently reinforces the status quo. So, for example, you know, at least in Chicago, but you know, I think in many other places, right? When the police shoot someone, their default before there's any information that has gone out there, they say they had a gun and they were in a gang, and they try to paint this narrative, knowing that like maybe clarity about more information about who this person was will come later. This is what happened with, you know, Adam Toledo, but they use it as a smear tactic. But then what we do in response is we play into that game of nitpicking these details of, you know, to try to kind of prove someone's humanity through things that we shouldn't have to, right? It doesn't matter if someone was in a gang. That doesn't mean they deserve to be killed or criminalized. It doesn't matter what somebody's GPA in high school was, or if they shoplifted a candy bar once. Like none of that matters when we're talking about police murder. And none of that matters to kind of qualify someone's humanity in the first place. And then I think we do the same thing when it comes to protests, right? Where the police paint this narrative of, oh, it was violent, there was looting. And, you know, I believe that we should affirm, you know, all kinds of tactics and actions that folks engage in as valid resistance and protest to what is fundamentally a much more deeply violent system of, you know, racial capitalism, of policing, of prisons that have, you know, robbed Black people of so much historically. But then the response to that, people are like, oh no, it was peaceful. And we play into and feed into this game of trying to prove that we're kind of more passive protesters when, you know, at the end of the day, a protest is meant to disrupt. And being disruptive does not mean that it's not justified. It doesn't mean the police are warranted in beating us down. What it does mean is that there's something valid to be disrupted. And so, yeah, those are just two pieces around framing where I think sometimes we kind of play into affirming the status quo and inadvertently, you know, kind of just give it more weight than it should have in the first place.
Yusuf?
And I just want to build on that. I can talk later if someone wants to jump in. But I just want to really appreciate what you just said about the framing and how we look at our communities. And I think it's one thing to talk about defunding police. We would hope that we talk about defunding policing, not just police officers. But then who's going to deal with the harm that's still in our communities? And so at our library and who we document with and who we work with, we organize with so-called gang members in the community. And that's a lot of what provides us safety in the space because the police are not helping us. The state has abandoned the neighborhood. At one point, there was these people that were trying to do some illegal dumping in our garden space at the library. And the so-called gang members confronted them and said, you can't dump your trash here, it's a library. And the people that were doing the dumping pulled out guns on them. And the people that were on our side, I mean, we weren't even there, but they didn't have guns, but they just stood there and said, yeah, you're not gonna dump your trash here. And so my question is like, who else is gonna stand in front of that gun? We recently just got robbed. Someone broke into our library, stole all our computers, stole a scanner, all this stuff because COVID, people not around. It was a young person. The neighborhood is the one who found out who did it. They talked to his mother. Their restorative justice that the neighborhood itself was doing. So there's things that are possible when you have relationships and community, and we're willing to talk about defund the police, but we're not willing to talk about who's in our communities that's going to deal with the harm. And so there's also a lot of conversation about mutual aid, as well as like, oh, don't call the police. There's other things. And it's like, yeah, people in our communities already had a policy. Like, let's talk to people that have been living for decades, knowing that I'm not calling the police. And I have other avenues to deal with harm in my community. So I just want to put that out there. And that's part of it. And we did a focus group with Burgess and some other folks. And we brought people from our neighborhood that are never considered legitimate by a lot of activists. And that was one of the best focus groups that they had in terms of talking about some of the programs in California. So that's who we do our work with.
Thank you for that. We have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, but I want to pose one last question to the panelists, and then we'll go on to Q&A if that's okay with everyone. So every time I think of a final question, I always have my students in mind, because so many of them are interested in this kind of memory work as well as activist work, but also learning and unlearning the right language for justice-oriented work. So this again is a question for all the panelists. In what ways can we reimagine the Black web that also accounts for documenting a range of experiences, from protest movements like we've been talking about to popular culture reference? So in other words, what questions should we be asking ourselves? What frameworks should we be developing for communities? What practices should we engage that account for all the ways that Black folks show up for each other online and offline? I would like for anyone can jump in on that one.
I was just going to say a lot of like what Dr. Now did by coming into our community and looking at the space that we were in and giving us kind of resources to kind of build more archives and to be more like intentional on cataloging information. I think that that's something that's essential right now. When I was 14 years old, I got this book called Self-Black Determination. And it was a catalog and a book of all these different narratives from enslaved people that the Library of Congress had accumulated and had created in this published manual. And I learned from that. At the time, I learned about like the accent, about the descriptors, about how language can be used to kind of create social circumstances, right? How it can be used to hold you into space, and how like just like deliberately, right? And it kind of, in my mind for the rest of my life, when people would speak to me, I had to kind of understand what terms they were using and how they were suggesting things to me. And that's a very powerful tool, because no one can really intimidate you or create a circumstance where you agree to something that is harmful to you. And I think that that type of education, knowing who we are, knowing how language is applied, knowing how like, you know, history has kind of identified where we are in the space today. Yesterday, during the panel, when they were talking about how people were researching people in religious spaces in churches so that they could kind of create and frame policy around how to kind of, you know, get us politically interested. And I started immediately thinking like, oh yeah, faith-based organization. Like when we went to the White House to talk about, you know, gun violence in our communities, they were like, well, haven't you talked to your faith-based leaders? And I'm like, they're standing with the police. They're in partnership with the government. They're state partners. They're not actually faith-based for my community. Our community faith-based is that we didn't give up hope and that we are surrendering to each other and counting on each other. But I think we need to make that more plain so that even those people that we think are malicious in their intent can understand whose side they're on, why that appeal to that creation of capitalism and that formation of corporate response and participation is so violent to the people that they say they represent. I think getting that from the archivists and the library communities and putting that out as a fundamental tool will help us create less chaos in our communities. Because I'm tired of, you know, fighting Black people in our communities for our safety because they feel like the participation on the side of the status quo is what's going to keep them safe. It's not. We have too much evidence that none of us are safe as long as we're on different sides of this situation. When we talk about Black lives and how they matter, the value of who we are in society is important in order to not undermine that. And so, I mean, Liberated Archives to me is everything. I learned so much about our community through looking through my great grandmother's scrapbook and then researching that information in city archives. But who would know to do that? I used to work for an accountant and an auditor. I'm always looking for information, but who would know to do that? It empowers you when you do. And so having more access is just like, that's what I think we need, because our babies deserve it and they don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Yep, absolutely.
And I would just like to add on to that. I think it's so important that we remain like a hold on our narrative. When I was younger, growing up with the internet, of course, I was always journaling. I have like 20 different spiral notebooks that I've had since I was like 14 that I keep, probably younger. But online, I was using Zanga, LiveJournal, MySpace, all of these things to document how I felt. And as I grew up, I started to feel like it wasn't a safe space for me anymore. I realized that I was sharing this space with other, people that maybe weren't interested in like my life or who I was as a person. Me sharing those thoughts became scary. It became violent because I was met with that type of reaction online. And I think that that's why it's so important that even if we're not sharing it online, that we keep a journal, that we make sure that we understand our history, like what the archives with Teresa saying. Make sure that you're researching where you live, the laws, how it was founded, why you're in this, like what your family has faced, the struggles they faced, and why those are still prevalent today. I think it's also important that we make sure we read up on things that have happened in our time, but also realizing that it wasn't that far, that it didn't happen a long time ago. The more that we can familiarize ourselves with this fact, because I feel like the media tries to put a lot of pictures or a lot of things in like past tense, like gray photos or people that are in like black and white clothing. And it's like, no, if you digitize these archives and you see them in the full color, you see them as they are today, it brings the fact that this is still happening. It keeps it fresh in your mind. It reminds you why you're fighting. It reminds you to complete what they started. You know what I mean? I feel like it gives you a new diligence to continue pushing your own narrative and to continue that fight. So I really, especially living in Oregon, I mean, this place is very interesting, like it was based on exclusionary laws. To think that that's a thing of the past is just dead wrong, So I'm constantly learning about where I'm at and what Portland has in store for me and learning how to fight that. So I don't think it can be said enough that we have to learn our history.
Right. Thank you. Asha?
Yeah, I think two questions, we can ask ourselves. One is how we're disrupting the status quo, which we've kind of talked a bit about. And then the other piece is how are we kind of telling a fuller picture? I think as an organizer, the kind of documentation of past struggles and even just current and recent ones that I'm always yearning for is sort of, what's the deep organizing behind the flashy headline worthy kind of moment and protest, right? Like I want to learn about not just the protests and the famous speeches and the things that typically get a lot of attention, but the internal debate, the long meetings, the hard decisions that were made, all of the doors that were knocked on and the hard conversations. And I think that is just such there's just such a wider breadth to the texture of what goes into movement building and organizing than kind of the typical things that we see, famous pictures of. And I think that there's just so much at stake in being able to document and tell the full picture of what goes into the work that we do, so that we don't romanticize movement or think that it's easier to build power than it really is, or think that, the struggles that we're building on didn't make mistakes or that we're the first ones to try something. It is just, there's a lot at stake with that. And so, yeah, that's something that I always love to just lift up. I think a piece of that, not just documenting kind of a few highly visible leaders, but, all of the many, many organizers who may not be the person on the bullhorn at the protest all the time, but maybe they are the one, running the organizing meeting or having those hard conversations. And I've just seen that come up as there's kind of here in Chicago, a new crop of younger, I'm 27, but there's like a crop of like younger than me and my peers, organizers that like, they don't know about the like occupation that, folks did in 2017 on the West Side and how they, were out there across the street from a police torture facility, like feeding folks on the West Side of Chicago. And there's so many lessons from that, that even in the really, really recent past, younger organizers don't know about. And we rely a lot on kind of relationships and telling stories and things like that. But how are we kind of documenting from the recent past and the not so recent past and the present, just some of the background of the organizing, the strategy, that hard, less visible work. that there's so much to learn from.
I appreciate you lifting up the ordinary and the mundane. That's very important. Dr. Jackson, I want to come to you with this question.
Yeah, that is a great segue to what I was going to say, which is just that I know that this particular panel is on activism, and it's just been so full. But I think one thing for me that I've really appreciated, and challenges from colleagues and others that I've really appreciated, and I'm thinking specifically of Andre Brock's work and Moya Bailey's work, that part of the work of archiving the fullness of the Black experience is that we shouldn't just be archiving struggle. We shouldn't just be archiving protest. We shouldn't just be archiving death. We shouldn't just be archiving violence, but we should be archiving, what Andre Brock calls the libidinal, or what Moya Bailey calls the digital alchemy, right? The brilliance, the humor, the joy, the sex, all the things that are part of the Black experience belong in the archive just as much as the sort of archiving of the resistance and activist narratives, because part of, I think, what we're struggling and fighting for in the resistance, right, is to have the space to do the joy and to do the mundane and to just be basic, instead of having to be fighting. And so, I think just when you said what could we do to expand, how we're archiving the Black experience, that of course was the first thing that I thought of.
That's beautiful. Yes. Yusuf, I'm going to come to you with this one.
And yeah, just to build on that, I think that's one of the most important things for us at our archive is documenting the everyday and everyday work as both a side of resistance and a side of joy. So things like meeting agendas, baby photographs, all kinds of things that tell our stories in ways that connect us to what Audre Lorde would call the erotic. I can't remember this brother's name, but the sovereignty of the quiet, right? Like how do we document our interiority? I know somebody know who that is. The other thing I think is people talk about when they want to do this work that they don't want to do any harm. And I think in any relationship, it's a struggle. And if you go into going there's going to be harm, but how do we engage each other respectfully, responsibly, ethically along the way and try to mitigate as much harm as possible, but not going into it thinking that in the context of racial capitalism in this historical moment, that somehow we can exist in spaces with no harm. And so giving ourselves permission to engage before we know all the perfect answers. Again, I think also embracing the complexity. So as for us, at least archival work consent in archival work is an ongoing practice and process. So what if somebody gives you Black Panther newspapers and then 5 years later, they're a Trump supporter and they want you to shred all the newspapers because they no longer agree with it. So a lot of times people say, well, we want community to have control over the collections always. And for us at that point, I'm responsible for the collective and I'm not shredding those newspapers just because now you want us to do that, even though you donated it, right? So we do want people to have consent. We do want people to have a voice over it, but we know that it's not always as easy as that. And I think the other main key thing is that when we're struggling of how to do this work and how do we be mindful of ourselves and where we are in this, that we remember who we're doing this for, right? That we're always centering the value and the love for Black life. And I think it's Fred Moten maybe, but for us, our understanding is that we're willing for the archive to burn, that the archive is not what's precious. Our lives are precious, that so much has already been lost to us and we're still here. So we're gonna be all right. So even if whatever we have a 9,000 square foot building, we have more things than we could ever go through in a lifetime at our archive, but we're willing to lose that if it's going to save our lives, if it's going to better the living conditions that we have. The paper is not what's precious. And so as we do this, we keep our mind on ourselves and our lives and the quality of the spaces in which we have to live.
You are preaching for sure. Thank you so much for that. And this is probably a good time to also shout out the next panel that's coming up, which is Cultivating Black Joy as Resistance Online with Dr. Meredith Clark, Dr. Adam Meeks, Dr. Douglas Wade Bruton. So I think this is a good segue in terms of the whole conference and thinking about not just those struggle spaces, but what is on the other side. And I appreciate everyone for taking us there. Right now, I want to get into some of the Q&A. We have lots of questions. So I think what I'll just do is I will read the first question as they come in, and anyone on the panel can jump in, and we'll try to do this in a timely manner. I want to make sure I get to as many questions as I can. So this question comes from Kyle, an archiving grad student. There are a lot of issues discussed regarding how to protect social media users when archiving their posts, since metadata can contain name, location, etc. But it sounds like that can also be important for activists when aid is urgently needed or police narratives need to be challenged. Here's the question. Do you have any suggestions for how to balance these issues? Archiving, it sounds like archiving and balancing the need for what social media does in terms of providing aid and challenging narratives.
I'll answer that. When my nephew was killed in 2010, I intentionally made social media networks and groups that I could use to kind of communicate to different community members for different reasons. One of them was I lost a loved one to gun violence and I wanted to stop. Another one was like 40 days seeking community. Finally, we ended up getting like the Don't Shoot Portland, Communities Against Racism, Artists for Black Lives. And utilizing the internet as a space and using Facebook and Twitter and all these different spaces to create different intersects to communicate, it created less chaos. And it helped me kind of formulate and engage directly with those different mediums that we needed in order to elevate or to kind of like keep things anonymous. So in private groups, we could have conversations and we could take them offline. We could have events with organizers in our community that weren't really promoted on any other sites. And then on the other sites, you could see kind of like engagement and education and programs that were being developed through these spaces where we were quiet, but intentionally to build community. So it's kind of like, like you have to have a diversity of tactics, right? The same way with your communication. If you're doing food and mutual aid work, make a space directly for that, build a network around that so that that's all that comes in there. How you're doing that, take that offline. We have to learn, and even with COVID, how to communicate out of spaces where we're being identified and watched and used. But yeah, I intentionally just broke up the spaces so that they couldn't kind of direct anything happening directly to me. Using Communities Against Racism for Black Lives, that gave like activists, photographers, videographers a space to just send us the information that kind of wasn't connected to our organizing and activism. And you just have to do that. You have to make discrete spaces and you have to build the networks behind them so they can be usable.
Thank you. I'm going to read this question and ask that maybe we can answer it in the chat since it's a resource question. This comes from Monia, who is a librarian at HBCU and has been increasingly asked to help students find Black narratives online to research and translate for school assignments. So the question is, do any of you have any tips, tools, or favorite resources? Curious on the topics are around social justice and police brutality, Black Lives Matter, social media hashtags, racial solidarity, microaggression, womanism. So if any of our panelists or anyone also watching has any resources, please type those into the chat box. The next question I want to go to, and this is open to the panelists. Kenita, good morning. Thank you for being here and providing the information. My question has to do with the narrative with respect to the Bones Tree Africa killing and bombing of, bombing of the African homestead in Philadelphia and the subsequent use of her remains by UPenn and Princeton. Yep, we know about this. Question is, how do we connect and take over the narrative as it relates to the historic misuse, abuse, and appropriation of our bodies? It's also connected to how these institutions have used First Nation remains, et cetera.
Yeah, I guess as a faculty member of the University of Pennsylvania, I'll start. This has been sitting very heavy with many of us for obvious reasons, and is just one of the most heinous things. But we're following the lead of activists. I mean, that's how the narrative gets changed. Is even those of us who work at these institutions, these white supremacist institutions, who would not have righted this and would not have addressed this if they weren't called out to do so, are following that, or the organizing of student activists. And at the University of Pennsylvania, that's Police Free Penn, who have, far before we learned about the possession of the MOVE remains and the use of the MOVE remains, have been working to get the Penn Museum to return and repair harm from older remains of both Native American and slave remains that were collected by, white supremacist, eugenicists, anthropologists 100 years ago. And they've been on the forefront of doing that, in addition to, trying to get police off campus and many other things. And so I think part of that work is that it's obviously interconnected to other sorts of Black activist work and spaces. And one thing I've been trying to do is share and use the language that is coming out of the activist spaces, because just like there's such a thing as propaganda, there's also university-aganda, or whatever you want to call it, right? Where, universities that are often participating in violence against, the Black people and communities in which they are based, want their PR narratives to be the dominant ones and want their PR narratives to be in the headlines. Eduganda, yeah, I don't know, whatever we want to call it, right? But that it's important in those cases, just like in some of these other cases that we have talked about, that we center the activist narratives, and those of us who in one way or another have the power to do that or are in the spaces to do that, I think very much, need to take responsibility for doing so.
Great. Thank you. This is another question, another resource question. So I'll ask our panelists if they can type in some resources. This is from an anonymous attendee. I wanted oral histories of the DC protests from Black women at the protests. Instead, shockingly, I have more law enforcement able to speak of their experience as Black fathers, white fathers with Black sons. It's a lot of fear to speak our own truth. Any suggestions for oral history? So that's a question for the chat box. This next question comes from Yvonne. Thank you for sharing this amazing knowledge. Really interesting to hear how Teresa and Ty have been able to pull together, curate documentation to bring cases. I'm wondering, were there any challenges in that process, and are there any ways they think documentation could be done or archived better that would make it easier for advocates like them to make use of collections of documentation in their work?
Well, for us, because we already provide a lot of mutual aid and direct advocacy services, we just continue using like our third party. We didn't use Google for obvious reasons, but we use like JotForm to get the information out. And our big social media, we have to, we use a lot of art to kind of communicate to the community things that are happening and to bring people together for educational purposes. And so using those same platforms, we were able to kind of like have communities show up for a community and saying, hey, do you know someone that's been harmed? And really using science as a measure, like everyone knew there was a pandemic, a global pandemic, and everyone wanted to find ways to help. So if someone had been tear gassed, we knew that it was causing irreparable harm. And we asked the community to help share that information, and building that base made it like, oh, it's essential. This is another essential need, because they tear gas people in my neighborhood. They tear gas people near my kids' school, near a park in my home, or in downtown Portland. And so it made it like it was a necessity for everyone to be involved, because even if you weren't protesting, if there was tear gas being deployed in your community, we know that it was actually going into people's homes and backyards and affecting their whole environment. And so just kind of using and building a narrative that involves all of our need to be outraged or all of our need to be engaged is how we were able to get such a good response, because people weren't just thinking like, oh, those bad people downtown. They were thinking like, oh, shoot, I live downtown and I did smell gas and I was choking and there is a pandemic, and that does, exasperate the respiratory system. And so why would they harm us like that? Like that, putting out the science first kind of created like, hey, we don't have responsible leaders and everyone should speak up against this. And that was, like it really helped, because people were concerned, and even people that didn't agree with the movement found concern because of the research involved in the science descriptor of why they should fill out that form. And outside of pandemic, it's the same thing. We know that the fight for Black Lives Matter is a human rights and dignity fight that's been established by our elders and ancestors before us, because we've never been okay with being enslaved. And so again, showing the humanity in that and the basic needs for all of us to be a participant in resistance has created a circumstance where people respond to the things that we do. We don't pick sides. We don't undermine people's methodology. If they break windows, we're thankful that no one was harmed in the breaking of the windows. And we try to keep that going throughout how we participate in community unapologetically. If the museum wants to work with us, they got to know that we don't care if somebody goes in there and busts their windows. You know, if there's a university that's working with us, they have to understand that we don't want them collecting data from our community, you know, like just putting that out there so that the people that support our work realize we're not exploiting them, so that they can feel secure and getting support.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think sorry, we have time for just 2 more questions, but this is a question from Jacob for Ty, real quick. I wanted to ask about the organization Ty mentioned that compiles activist videos, sanctioned violence, and drone footage. What's it called again?
So it was from Situ NYC. I'll go ahead and drop it in the chat, but it was a digital reconstruction to illustrate the police violence. And I really think that it was able, like Teresa was saying, when we brought the science, initially we published a report that was compiled by Black doctors and researchers. It's right there in the chat. And that allowed people to see what was happening. I mean, we all knew that COVID was rampant. We all knew that we were being forced to stay in our homes and not socialize. And then for people to come out into the streets and then be brutalized like that, we already knew that, but we had to illustrate it on the record in ways that people could understand. People love to have their facts, to feel like there's no bias in it. It's like as if Stop Killing Us was not understood enough. The science explained that for us. So, and then with Situ, just being able to see the drone footage from above, there was no, it made the police response invalid. It showed that there was no reason for them to engage in this sort of destruction and using the rocket launchers at such close range. It showed how they were targeting people's areas so that they couldn't run away. Yeah, it was just very illuminating video.
Thank you for that resource. This is the final question that we can get to because of time. This comes from Willie Morris, Executive Board Member at the SUNY Black Faculty and Staff Collective nonprofit. And this is for the entire panel. Anyone can chime in on this one. We receive a lot of support from folks in the system and now are being asked to work with senior leaders in colleges to motivate change. My questions are, how can MITE activists work with a system that has its own interests and desires to push its own narrative? How do we keep the narrative honest and keep our leaders honest? How can activists keep themselves honest? How can we preserve our narratives? And what tools, tech, practices are out there that could support us in that honesty work? And finally, much love, Chicago from the Southside Kid. So this is a question about what we can do, honestly.
And just a quick resource on a lot of this, whether it's oral histories or documenting state violence, doing it with care for our peoples. I think Texas After Violence, I think they're in here. They're, to me, a leader in the field doing a lot of great things. And so I definitely check them out in terms of how to do this work. I think in terms of the question you just posed, a lot of it's just keeping those questions on the table, right? It's always engaging those questions as you go. And someone else had mentioned all the oral histories of the police officers. And Malcolm talked about being in the house versus being in the field. And I think for us, both of those are potentially revolutionary positions. And so if you can get oral histories of police officers, go ahead and do that. And someone else can get other oral histories. We send people all the time to get documents from universities or nonprofits or things that we might not ourselves be able to get, but the information is useful for our communities. And then other people can do work with, the people that's lost loved ones. And so take advantage of your position. You don't necessarily always have to deconstruct where you at to then go out into the hood, but use where you are to get information that we can use for our communities.
And I was going to say, use your resources to help us write more books. I think like the work that activists and organizers are doing One of the things that I realized was that we don't have enough, first responder information. Going back to our communities, we'll learn about, one person in history and we'll buy their books for 50 years without realizing there's like, a whole generation behind that activism or behind those stories that we missed out on. And so I think that at this time of so much change happening, that is really important to help us publish and document what we're doing, because most of the work is like we're using these communication tools online to educate, inform, and engage. And how much easier would it be for us to go back into our own archives and start documenting and cataloging and sharing these resources with our community, rather than watching generations of activists come up and make mistakes that are unnecessary mistakes when you're fighting for your life. Like, it becomes a safety issue when you're like this past summer, when everyone showed up for George Floyd, being a seasoned activist and a community organizer and not having the physical ability to show up on the front line, and knowing that people need directives and support and suggestions on how to be safe and how to organize within their spaces, just for safety, just to not be identified by the police. Like how Asha was saying, like there's a generation that like stuff that happened in 2017, they're not even aware of. And there are people that are showing up at protests, filming and taking pictures. They don't know that, censoring those faces of people is creating evidence for the police. But I think that if academia wants a relationship with organizers, don't just research what we're doing right now, help us document it and create the information so that we can give it to our communities, so that children that are growing up in resistance right now will have information available to them. I know that when I first started organizing, I didn't understand really why Dr. King was protesting and why he was marching. And within 3 to 4 years after my nephew's death, and when, Mike Brown's murder happened, and then again, now with George Floyd and all those in between, I realized that nonviolent direct action meant that we're going into this direct action and we're not going to be violent, but we get to document the violence that happens to us. Like it was intentional. They knew that there was going to be a response of violence, and they intended to show that response to the world so that people would help us dismantle the reasons behind it and the supportive policy that allowed it. And so we need those references. We need that communication published and shared for generations, in my opinion, because we can't keep doing the work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we are at time, and I'm certain we could talk about this all day. I really just want to thank you all so much for joining us, for the folks who are in the chat and watching, and especially to our panelists. I'm always grateful to be in your space. And thank you to the folks who have organized the event and the panel, and there's much more to go for the rest of the day. You can keep the conversation going on Twitter using the hashtag ATBW2021, right? Yes, and please also, you can find, I think most of us on Twitter, our bios are also on the side chat, so please do keep in touch. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists for such a wonderful discussion. We just really appreciate. I'm stunned and struck. I'm just so excited about the rest of the conversation. My name is Holly Smith. I am one of the project partners. I have the pleasure of being one of the project partners. I am the archivist at Spelman College, and just wanted to say, I didn't mean between to get everybody in the music. I just wanted to let everybody know we have a brief break where you can enjoy some more music from DJ Nooney and Scooter Brown, and as well as see what else is coming up for the rest of the day. So please sit back, enjoy, continue to stay engaged in the chat, and we will be back in about 10 minutes. Thank you.